The cartographer's stylus stopped moving. Vel Orath had cataloged 11,000 star systems in her career. She had documented species that communicated through bioluminescent skin patterns, civilizations that built their cities entirely underwater, a race that experienced time in reverse relative to every other known organism in the galaxy. She had seen things that redefined the boundaries of possible, but she had never seen a timestamp like this one. The record she was reviewing was old, flagged as routine, pulled from a deep archive because a junior analyst had noticed an anomaly in a mineral survey near the Orion Spur. The anomaly itself was nothing remarkable. What was remarkable was the date attached to it. The humans had filed the claim 237 years ago, before first contact, before anyone in the conclave had known humans existed. Before the species had possessed, by any official record, the capacity for interstellar transit. Vel Arath set down her stylus. She looked at the timestamp for a long time without blinking. Then she opened a second file, then a third. Her office was very quiet. The conclave of settled worlds had a saying that translated roughly as, "Patience is what civilizations perform when they lack sufficient power to act." It was considered wisdom. It had been repeated in chambers of governance and philosophical discourse for 4,000 years by a dozen species who believed it completely, without reservation, without exception. They had never thought to ask whether patience itself could be a weapon. They had never had reason to. Every species the conclave had encountered operated on some version of the same fundamental logic: acquire resources, develop capability, project power. The timeline compressed or extended depending on biology and circumstance, but the shape was always recognizable. You could model it. You could predict the inflection points. You could integrate a new civilization into existing structures before it became inconvenient, and the whole galaxy continued turning with minimal disruption. Humans had been discovered, or rather, humans had allowed themselves to be discovered 41 years ago, when a conclave survey vessel detected electromagnetic signals from a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. The first contact team had approached with the standard posture, diplomatic, measured, carrying with them the implicit weight of 10,000 years of conclave authority. The humans had been polite, almost aggressively polite in retrospect. They had signed every treaty presented to them, agreed to every resource limitation, accepted every trade restriction, smiled through every condescension. And for 41 years, they had remained exactly where the conclave expected them to remain, a minor, developing species on the outer margins, technically affiliated, politically irrelevant, carefully and cheerfully contained. The first mystery was the timestamp. The second was why it wasn't the only one. The third, and this was the one that made Vel Arath's hands go still on her desk, was what the word contained had actually meant to the humans all along. She sent the files to Senior Analyst Doros Khan with a single line of accompanying text. "I need you to look at these before you do anything else today." Doros was not easily unsettled. He was Varanthi, a species whose neurological architecture processed threat assessments faster than most beings could register them consciously, and he had spent 30 years in the Conclave's intelligence division reviewing exactly the kinds of records that would make other species curl into protective postures. He called her back in 40 minutes. That alone told her something. "How far back does it go?" she asked before he could speak. "Further than I'm comfortable saying out loud on an open channel." A pause. "Come to my office. Bring the physical files." "You don't use physical files." "I do now." She gathered everything and walked the length of the administrative complex in something that was not quite a hurry and not quite calm. The corridors were busy with the ordinary traffic of conclave bureaucracy, functionaries carrying reports, junior analysts clustered around data terminals, the low harmonic hum of a building that believed it understood the galaxy it was managing. Doros had his door closed. That was also unusual. "Sit down," he said when she entered. He didn't look up from the display spread across his desk. Tell me what you know about the Mineral Survey Act of Conclave, year 1847. It allowed pre-contact species to file provisional resource claims if they could demonstrate, she stopped, if they could demonstrate knowledge of interstellar survey law, which humans couldn't have had in 1847. He looked up. His secondary eyes, the ones Varantha used for threat assessment, were fully dilated. And yet here are 214 filings spread across 43 star systems, all predating first contact, all technically compliant with conclave law down to the correct formatting codes, all filed under species designations that don't match any known civilization. He placed one hand flat on the desk. Until you cross-reference the mineral composition signatures with Earth's geological survey data, then they match perfectly. Vel Arath sat down. They were filing claims, she said slowly, through proxies. Through proxies they shouldn't have been able to contact, using legal frameworks they shouldn't have known existed, 2 centuries before we knew they existed. He closed the display. How long were they watching us before we found them? Neither of them answered the question. The answer sat in the room with them anyway, patient as anything, waiting. The human ambassador was named Sorand Vale, a small woman by human standards, which still made her unremarkable by the physical scale of most conclave species. She had held her position for 11 years. She had attended 1,100 diplomatic functions. She had been smiled at, spoken over, condescended to, and dismissed in every formal and informal context the conclave offered, and she had responded to all of it with the same expression, attentive, warm, slightly amused, as if she were watching a play she had already read the script of. Doros had requested a private meeting. She arrived exactly on time, accepted tea she didn't drink, and waited for him to speak first. "I'd like to ask you something outside of formal channels," he said. "Of course," she said. Her voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. "How long has humanity been aware of the conclave?" She tilted her head, as if she were genuinely considering how to answer. Not as if she were surprised by the question. "That depends on what you mean by aware. Let's start with the mineral filings." There was a pause. It was not the pause of someone caught off guard. It was the pause of someone deciding which door to open. "You found those faster than we expected," she said, and there was something different in her voice now, not less pleasant, just more honest. "We thought it would be another decade, maybe 2. You expected us to find them eventually. We expected you to find them when we were ready for you to find them. The timing is a little early." She glanced at her tea. "We'll adapt." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "Ambassador," Doro said carefully, "I need you to understand that what I've found in these archives has significant implications for humanity's standing with the conclave. The treaties signed at first contact were predicated on our ignorance," she said pleasantly. "We know. That was by design." She set her cup down gently. "Doros. Can I call you Doros? We've known each other 11 years. She didn't wait for permission. The conclave has a 100-year integration protocol, 40 years of assessment, 30 years of monitored expansion, 30 years of graduated inclusion. At the end of it, a species receives full voting rights and genuine political standing, but only if they've remained compliant through all 100 years. She smiled. "We read the protocol. Before first contact. We read all of your protocols. That's not possible. And yet." She stood. "I think you should look at the timestamps on those files more carefully. Not just the earliest ones, the recent ones too." She smoothed her jacket. A human gesture. Automatic. Almost unconscious. "Pay attention to the intervals." She left. The door closed behind her with a sound like something ending. Doros looked at the intervals. It took him 6 hours to understand what he was seeing, and another 3 hours before he was willing to accept it. He called Vel Arath at the end of the 9th hour. His voice, when she answered, had a quality she'd never heard in it before. "The filings aren't random," he said. "They're not even strategic in the way I thought. They're not claiming the most resource-rich systems or the most tactically significant positions." A long breath. "They're claiming everything adjacent to every system the Conclave is planning to expand into. Not is currently expanding into. Is planning to. Based on internal projections we haven't published. Internal projections from sealed policy documents." Velaroth found she was gripping the edge of her desk. "The filings are dated ahead of the expansion plans," she said, "by an average of 60 years. Silence. "They didn't just read our protocols," she said. "No." Doros's voice was very controlled. "They read our intentions. 60 years before we had them." Another pause, longer this time. Vel-Arath. "How long does a human live? 80 to 100 years. Maybe more with medical intervention." "So the humans who filed the earliest claims are dead," she said. "They've been dead for decades. They filed legal claims for systems they would never live to see settled, for a strategy they would never live to see completed." He went quiet for a moment. "They planned this across multiple human generations. People who died without knowing if it would work, without knowing if anyone would continue after them." His voice dropped, "And they continued anyway." Velverath thought about the Conclave saying, "Patience is what civilizations perform when they lack sufficient power to act." She thought about it very carefully. Then she thought about a species that had looked at the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, 237 years before it had the power to challenge it openly, and had decided, "We will wait. We will prepare. We will be so patient that patience itself becomes the strategy, and no one will recognize it as strategy until it is already won. I need to escalate this," she said. "To who?" His voice was strange. "We're looking at a framework that spans 2 centuries. Whatever we escalate it to, whatever body we convene, whatever response we formulate, Vel-Araf, they planned for that too." The emergency session of the Inner Conclave was called 4 days later. 12 representatives of the eldest member species convening in a chamber that had witnessed every major civilizational crisis of the last 4,000 years, all of them looking at the same set of documents that Velarath had first uncovered. Soren Vale attended. She had been invited as a courtesy. As the human representative, she was technically entitled to observe proceedings that directly concerned human affairs. She sat at the far end of the chamber in the chair designated for junior affiliates, which was smaller and positioned below the main dais, a fact that had never been accidental. She folded her hands in her lap and observed. The initial deliberations lasted 6 hours. The Conclave's instinct was to pursue invalidation of the pre-contact filings on the basis of procedural fraud. The proxies used had been synthetic entities, shells, technically legal under the relevant statutes but morally indefensible. 3 of the 12 representatives argued this point with increasing conviction. It was the Valthrani representative, an ancient being named Orosile, who stopped them. "Before we pursue that avenue," Orisil said, in the slow, oceanic voice of a species that measured time in geological epochs, "I would ask the ambassador one question." Soren Vale looked up. "The systems claimed," Orisil said. "The 214 filings. Your people did not file for the richest systems, not for the most strategically significant transit corridors. You filed for systems that were unremarkable by every metric." He paused. "Why those systems specifically?" Soren Bale was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands in her lap. Then she looked up, and her expression was the same pleasant one she always wore, but there was something beneath it now that she was no longer fully concealing. "They're not unremarkable," she said. "They're habitable." The chamber was very quiet. "Not for your species," she said. "Not for most species in the Conclave. Atmospheric composition, too oxygen-rich. Gravity too varied. Temperature ranges too extreme, uninhabitable by your standards. Economically worthless. She tilted her head slightly. For humans, they're fine. Orosil was silent for a long time. How many of those systems, he said slowly, could sustain permanent human colonies? All 214, she said. For a starting population of about 40 billion, the number was large. It was not, by galactic standards, enormous. But the Conclave's integration protocol included a population threshold. A species could not hold more than a certain number of permanent settlements outside its home system before acquiring the political standing to resist oversight. It was a cap, a careful, deliberate cap, designed to prevent exactly this. Doros, seated in the analyst gallery, did the arithmetic before anyone else in the room. "You're already above the threshold," he said. "Not a question. The colonies, you already have colonies in those systems." Soren Vale looked at him with an expression that was almost apologetic. "We've had colonies," she said, "in 37 of those systems for over 100 years. She let the silence hold for exactly long enough. The rest of the infrastructure is further along than the filings might suggest. How much further? The head of the chamber said, and his voice was flat because he was trying to keep something else out of it. "The last survey we completed," she said, "put our off-world population at approximately 290 billion. The arithmetic of the Conclave's population threshold rearranged itself into something the chamber was not prepared to process. 290 billion humans, distributed across dozens of star systems the Conclave had never inspected, living in habitats no Conclave species had thought worth surveying. Having spent 237 years doing the one thing no species in recorded galactic history had ever managed to do without anyone noticing, growing. Not conquering, not claiming, not demanding, not fighting, just growing. "We didn't hide," Soren Vale said, and now her voice was very calm, very clear. "We filed every claim. We paid every fee. We registered every settlement in the technically correct format with the technically correct authority. Everything we did was legal." She paused. "You just never checked, because we never seemed important enough to bother checking." This was the moment. Not the revelation of the filings, not the discovery of the threshold breach, not even the staggering population number. This was the moment that Aura Sil, 4,000 years old, who had watched civilizations rise and collapse and been unmoved by most of it, understood what the humans had actually done. They had not outmaneuvered the Conclave. They had outweighted it. Every treaty, every concession, every polite smile at every condescending diplomatic function had been real. The humans had not been pretending to be lesser. They had simply been patient, in the same way a river is patient with a stone. Not planning the erosion, not angry about the resistance, just moving continuously toward the place it was always going to reach. "Ambassador," Orosil said slowly, "when your first contact team met our survey vessel 41 years ago, did you know then what you were doing?" She shook her head. "I wasn't born yet, 41 years ago." A small smile. "But yes, the people who met your survey vessel knew. They'd been briefed on protocols that had been passed down for 160 years, for 11 generations." She looked around the chamber, at the 12 representatives of the galaxy's eldest civilizations, at the chamber that had stood for 4,000 years. "We knew you'd have a 100-year integration timeline. We knew the threshold numbers. We knew the appeal mechanisms and the legal frameworks and the specific provisions in the Mineral Survey Act that allowed provisional claims." She paused. "We knew because we'd been watching you for 200 years before you found us. And we spent that time learning everything we could, and then we waited." "For what?" said one of the other representatives sharply. "What were you waiting for?" Soren Vale looked at the representative for a long moment. "To be in a position," she said, "where we didn't have to fight. The next 72 hours shook structures that had been stable for centuries. What emerged from the archive review was not a conspiracy. It was more unsettling than a conspiracy. A conspiracy has architects who can be identified and confronted. What the Conclave's analysts found, as they pulled file after file from archives that suddenly needed re-examining, was something that didn't have a single author or a single moment of decision. It was policy. Multi-generational, deliberately ordinary-seeming, intensely disciplined policy. There were records of human diplomatic archives, legally obtained after first contact through provisions the Conclave had considered formalities, that showed internal briefings passed from ambassador to ambassador, from generation to generation, with the careful detail of something too important to be left to individual initiative. Notes written by people who were dead before the notes became relevant. Strategic assessments by analysts who would never see the outcome. Children raised with detailed knowledge of conclave law because their parents had decided that the knowledge might matter in 100 years, and they wanted someone to have it. The humans had not been planning a war. They'd had the foresight to recognize they couldn't win one early on, not against the full weight of the conclave. The early records were clear on that. Blunt, even. We cannot fight this. We can outlast it. Vel Arath read one document, a policy memo from a human strategic council dated 180 years ago that contained a line she couldn't stop thinking about. The conclave will exist for another 10,000 years. Our goal is not to defeat it. Our goal is to still be here when it finally notices us. She thought about what it meant to be a species that looked at a 10,000-year institution and thought, we will still be here. Not defiantly, not heroically. Just with the calm certainty of something that had already decided it wasn't going anywhere. Doros, she said when she found him in his office, surrounded by documents. Have you considered the possibility that they're still not showing us everything? He looked up. The secondary threat assessment eyes hadn't closed since this started. Which part of everything? We know about the filings. We know about the colonies. We know about the threshold. She leaned against the doorframe. We know what they built while we weren't looking. But we don't know why they stopped hiding it. They said the timing was early, that they expected us to find it later. But why did the junior analyst find that anomaly? Why was it findable at all? Doros was quiet for a moment. You think they wanted us to find it? Not yet, she said. Not in the way they planned, but eventually. She looked at him. The question is what else they built while we're looking at this. The answer to that question took 14 more months to surface. And when it did, it came not from an archive or a leaked document or an intercepted transmission. It came from a human child. Her name was Mira Vale, Soren's daughter, 17 years old, attending a diplomatic exchange program on the Conclave's Central World. She was, by all accounts, an unremarkable student, slightly quieter than her human classmates. Good marks in history and interstellar law, spoke 6 languages with native fluency and 2 more with careful competence. She was studying in the Conclave's public archive when a Varanthi student named Kesto, working on his own research, seated at the next terminal, noticed something strange. She was reading a sealed document, not a classified document. Sealed documents didn't appear on public terminals. This was different. This was a document filed under a cross-registration protocol that theoretically made it inaccessible to non-conclave member species. A document that should have displayed as a permissions error to anyone without a senior conclave credential. Kesta watched her read it for 30 seconds before he leaned over. That file, he said carefully, should not be visible to you. She looked at him. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's pleasant expression. I know, she said, and turned back to the document. How are you accessing it? She considered the question with what seemed like genuine thought. The cross-registration protocol has an exemption for species above the population threshold, she said. We crossed the threshold about 100 years ago. The exemption populated automatically. But the threshold determination was stored in a system that wasn't integrated with the public archive credentials, so it never propagated. The permission exists. It just never got switched on. She glanced at him. Until we switched it on. Kesto said nothing for a moment. When did you do that? When we filed the threshold documentation with the correct administrative body. She scrolled down through the document with the calm focus of someone who had been looking forward to reading this for a while. 43 days ago. Kesto thought about this. He thought about a 17-year-old girl sitting in a public archive legally reading sealed conclave documents through a permissions exemption that had existed for a century without anyone activating it because no one had known it was there. Is this the only one? He asked. She looked at him again. The pleasant expression. Her mother's eyes. No, she said. The credential review that followed was the most exhaustive audit in the conclave's institutional history. It took 9 months and produced results that no one on the review committee was entirely prepared to accept. The humans had acquired, through technically legal applications of the population threshold exemption, valid access credentials to approximately 30% of the conclave's sealed administrative archive. Not the military or classified intelligence archives. Those had independent authentication that the exemption didn't touch. But the administrative archive contained everything else: infrastructure planning, expansion projections, resource allocation, internal policy debates spanning 4,000 years of conclave governance. They'd had access for 43 days when Kesto caught Mira in the archive. The review committee's working estimate was that 43 days was not enough time to copy everything. The working estimate was wrong. They'd had access to the relevant legal pathway for years. The formal activation of the credential had been the final step in a process that had taken much longer. The question of exactly how much had been read, and when, and by whom, was not one the review committee was able to answer with confidence. It was Soren Vale herself who brought this to the conclave's attention, in writing, before the audit formally concluded. The letter was characteristically precise and characteristically pleasant, and it included a full accounting of what human analysts had accessed and when, not because they were required to disclose it, because they chose to. Why? Doros asked her when he read the letter. It was a private conversation, the kind they'd been having more of lately, stripped of the formal architecture of diplomatic exchange. You could have kept that concealed indefinitely. We might never have known the full scope. I know, she said. So why tell us? She was quiet for a moment, the longest pause he'd ever observed from her. Because, she said finally, we don't want to be in conflict with the conclave. We never did. We want to be in it, actually in it. Full membership, full standing, full vote. She looked at him steadily. What we've done looks aggressive. I understand that. From your perspective, it looks like preparation for confrontation. Isn't it? It's preparation for not needing one. She held his gaze. We know where every expansion corridor is planned for the next 3 centuries. We know the policy debates, we know the resource pressures, we know what the conclave is afraid of and what it wants and where it's overextended. She paused, and we disclosed it voluntarily. Because what we actually want is for you to understand that we could use that knowledge to hurt you, and we're choosing not to. That, Doros said, is either the most sophisticated diplomatic maneuver I've encountered in 30 years, or it's just what it is, she said quietly. We spent 237 years learning how this institution works, not to dismantle it, to belong to it, on equal terms. She looked out the window of his office, at the vast administrative complex, at the architecture of 4,000 years of institutional power. We don't want to destroy the conclave. We want to be the kind of species the conclave can't ignore anymore. The silence that followed was long. You already are, Doros said. The inner conclave voted on full membership 14 months later. It was not a clean vote. 3 species opposed it on principle, 2 on procedural grounds, and 1, The Varanthi delegation abstained on the basis that they wanted to formally register their belief that the situation should be studied for another century before any irreversible decisions were made. The motion passed anyway. The margin was uncomfortable, 7 in favor, 3 against, 1 abstention, 1 absence that was itself widely interpreted as a statement. The day Soren Vale walked into the full chamber as a voting member, not as a junior affiliate, not seated below the dais, but at the table. She was accompanied by a delegation of 4 other humans. One was her daughter. Vel Areth, watching from the analyst gallery, found herself thinking about all the people who had never seen this moment. All the humans who had filed mineral claims 2 centuries ago, who had drafted policy memos for successors they would never meet, who had learned conclave law and taught it to their children and died with the strategy still incomplete. All the people who had maintained patience as a discipline across generations in the specific and radical faith that someone would eventually finish what they had started. She thought about the memo. Our goal is not to defeat it. Our goal is to still be here when it finally notices us. They were here. The conclave had noticed. She found Doros after the session. "How are you processing it?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "I keep thinking about the threshold exemption," he said. "The 17-year-old girl in the archive. Something that complicated, that subtle. She knew it instantly. She'd been taught it. Someone, maybe before she was born, identified that exemption and decided it was worth passing down, just in case." He shook his head slowly. "That's not planning a strategy. That's teaching your children to be ready for a future you can't see." "That's what humans do," Velaroth said. "I know." He looked at the chamber doors, still open, through which the human delegation had just walked. "That's what frightens me." She thought about the question she'd asked 14 months ago in the early days of the archive discovery. They're still not showing us everything. She thought she understood now what the remaining unknown was. Not a hidden military asset, not a concealed technology, not another legal exemption waiting to be activated. Something less tangible and more durable than any of those things. The humans had spent 237 years not winning. Not fighting, not demanding, not forcing resolution. They had sat with a timeline that would outlast any individual human life, and they had kept moving within it, generation after generation, with the terrifying steadiness of something that had simply decided it was not going to stop. The patience had run out. Full membership, full standing, full voice in every chamber that shaped the future of the known galaxy. But Velarath found she could not look at Soren Vale's daughter, 17 years old, already fluent in 8 languages and conclave administrative law, without understanding that what had run out was not patience itself. What had run out was the need to hide it. The patience hadn't ended. It had simply changed what it was waiting for. And whatever that was, the conclave had not yet seen it. In the deepest part of the human diplomatic archive, accessible now to any conclave analyst with proper clearance, there was a document that predated every file Velaroth had discovered. A letter, written by hand, signed by a council of 12 human strategists who had spent their lives studying the light in the sky and wondering about what lived among it. The letter was addressed to no one in particular. "To whoever comes next," was how it began. It said many things in the careful and specific language of people trying to reach across a distance they could not measure. It said that the work ahead was long and would require more generations than they could count. It said that there would be moments of doubt and moments of fear, and that those moments should be expected and planned for and moved through. It said that the galaxy was not hostile to humanity, merely indifferent, and that indifference, given enough time, could be changed. The last paragraph was brief. "They will underestimate how long we are willing to wait. Let them." Patience is not the absence of ambition. It is ambition disciplined by the understanding that the only deadline that matters is the one we are still alive to meet. Do not hurry. Do not stop. These are not contradictions. They will notice us eventually. Be ready. The letter was dated 263 years ago, long before the mineral filings, long before the first surveys of conclave space, long before anyone in that 12-person council could have known whether any of it would work. Velroth read it twice. Then she filed it in her personal archive under a label she kept private, and she sat in her office for a long time looking out at the stars. The same stars that, somewhere out there, a dozen long-dead humans had looked at from a small blue planet and decided were worth waiting for. She didn't know whether to call what she felt fear or awe or respect. She thought perhaps those things, for the first time in her career, were the same.